country has to work for everyone, or it doesn't work for anyone in Roosevelt's mind.
Now, over the furious objections of the railroads and the powerful Republican senators they controlled, Roosevelt won passage of the Hepburn Act. It empowered the Interstate Commerce Commission to limit the rates the railroads could charge to move goods from place to place. And for the first time in American history, gave the rulings of a federal agency the force of law.
One of Teddy Roosevelt's great accomplishments was the Hepburn Act.
And I bring back David Woolen right now because it might look like a little footnote in history, but talk about the significance of the Hepburn Act and the fact that he was the first president who really campaigned on a piece of legislation, went around the country, and in many ways it was looking out for the consumer. We really hadn't heard that before.
Absolutely. You know, progressive era politics is very focused on this idea of the rise of industrial capitalism and the rise of monopoly. You know, the barons of industry, of course, are promoting free enterprise or promoting this idea of the free market system, which we all believe in. But when you start getting to the stage where, you know, companies like Northern Securities, the railroad conglomerate, or Standard Oil basically controls everything from A to Z in terms of oil production and can manipulate railroad rates, et cetera. It's no longer a free market. And the question was, you know, again, this is this new era that we're in. We're in an era of large-scale industrial capitalism. This is not an agrarian society anymore.
Yep.
And how does the government deal with that? How do you manage capitalism? You know, you know, the critics will say, well, this is socialistic, et cetera. But really what these presidents are trying to do, both in TR's case and FDR's case, is figure out a way to make capitalism work for the average American. You know, in getting the Hepburn Act passed, he set this precedent that really set the stage for the idea that the government has the right to regulate interstate commerce, that, you know, that the government has the right to manage a capitalist economy, to make sure that there's fair play, to make sure that there's equal opportunity for all.
And the idea of, we have this debate now, David, about the role of government. Does government have a job, or is it in the way? In many ways, for both Roosevelts, they ran into this, and FDR took government to a whole nother level. Set the stage as best you can. Just what he walked into in the first 100 days of the FDR administration, not just what he accomplished, but literally what he inherited day one.
Well, remember, the banking system in the United States had collapsed. I mean, the banks were no longer open. There's a great story about a guy who was working in the British Embassy, one of the staff, who, you know, basically took out all his cash because he realized the bank wasn't going to be open, and have the British ambassador coming to borrow money from him. I mean, there was imagine a country where the banking system has collapsed. Imagine a country where the volume of stock transactions had fallen by 90% since 1929. Imagine a country where unemployment is 25% nationwide, but over 50% in Detroit or Chicago, or the mayor of Chicago writing to the White House saying, send relief or send troops. I mean, the country was teetering on the brink of revolution at this point. And, you know, let's not forget, there was revolution in other countries. You had the rise of fascism, the rise of the Nazis, you know, totalitarian communism. So liberal capitalist democracy is under siege right around the world. So he's walking into a crisis of unprecedented proportions. It's a country that we would not recognize, unrecognizable.
For all the folks who in 2008 were saying we've never seen this before, not only had we seen it before, but the threats of what it could be actually happened, just as a historical reminder, right?
Absolutely. You know, and a lot of the reason that we didn't have as bad an experience with the Great Recession is because these safeguards that were put in place to make capitalism work, as I said before, unemployment insurance, Social Security, these kinds of measures.
The FDIC that we have.
The Federal Deposit and Insurance Corporation, yeah. How do you make capitalism, how do you mitigate the worst excesses of capitalism? That's what this is about. It's about saving capitalism. It's not about destroying capitalism. You know, how do you regulate the stock market? You know, in 1933, there were more regulations, or 32 when Roosevelt came in, 33, more regulations to buy a horse than to buy stock. I mean, you know, so our relationship with the government was minimal. The average person's only real tie to the U.S. government in 1933, 32 was the post office. And Roosevelt fundamentally changes. He convinces the American people that the government does have a responsibility to try to manage the economy in such a way as to make it fair for the average American. And
I'd be remiss if I didn't get to Eleanor Roosevelt, because she played a much bigger role than I think the general public knows, far beyond a traditional First Lady here. And there's a particular clip where they talk about Eleanor Roosevelt, and sure, she was known for being outspoken, particularly when it came to racial inequality issues when it wasn't very popular to do so. And she worked tirelessly to expand roles for women in the workplace and to see that servicemen were also receiving the proper care. Take a look at this clip.
Admiral William F. Bull Halsey, commander in the South Pacific, had been against her coming. He had a war to fight, he said, and no time to waste welcoming a visiting do-gooder. But when the First Lady turned up and went to work, Halsey quickly changed his mind.
Here is what Eleanor Roosevelt did in 12 hours. She inspected 2 Navy hospitals, took a boat to an officer's rest home and had lunch there, returned and inspected an Army hospital, reviewed the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion, made a speech at a service club, attended a reception, and was guest of honor at a dinner given by General Harmon. When I say that she inspected those hospitals, I don't mean that she shook hands with the chief medical officer, glanced into a sunroom and left. I mean that she went into every ward, stopped at every bed, and spoke to every patient. What was his name? How did he feel? Was there anything he needed? Could she take a message home for him? I marveled at her hardihood, both physical and mental. And she saw patients who were grievously and gruesomely wounded. But I marveled most at their expressions as she leaned over them. It was a sight I will never forget.
Over here, one soldier said, she was something none of us had seen in over a year, an American mother.
And it was much more, David, than that 12-hour trip. Behind the scenes, the pushing and the prodding of FDR. In many ways, she was the conscience of his administration, wasn't she?
Absolutely. You know, what's fascinating about the film as a whole, one of the things that really comes out, is the relationship between Eleanor Roosevelt and Teddy Roosevelt. And, you know, the opening segment is get action. And that notion that, you know, Theodore Roosevelt was driven. And that famous line, black hair never bothers a rider whose pace is fast enough. You know, he coped with life by doing, and she is cut of the same cloth. There's no question about it. She is a woman of action, a woman of determination, and a woman of incredible passion and compassion. You know, this, as we said earlier, the idea that you really couldn't have the Roosevelts without Teddy. In many ways, you couldn't have Franklin without Eleanor. I mean, it's Eleanor who takes him to Rivington Street, to the College Settlement House in 1904, that wonderful scene in the film, before they're married. And when he says, my God, I never knew people could live like that. I mean, he was aware of these things, and he was a man of great dedication to those in need, et cetera. But she enriched that component of his personality, no question. And she played that role throughout his administration. I mean, she was concerned even during the war that the New Deal reforms and New Deal measures might get pushed aside as they were, and kept reminding President Roosevelt that, you know, he shouldn't give up on these great social causes.
The public got to get a snapshot, 14 hours you want to call a snapshot, but a snapshot through this series of 2 political giants and a family here that really in many ways changed American history, and I would argue certainly for the better. David, thank you so much for the time. As always, I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rich. Okay,
when we come back, everyone, we're going to bring our legal panel in. They're going to weigh in on a lot of different issues, including that case out of Brooklyn we told you about earlier in the program, where an NYPD officer caught on camera bringing a pregnant woman to the ground on her stomach. And we'll get into those issues and much more straight ahead.